What's up YouTube? Danny Boy EDH back with another Commander Deck Tech video. Today we got Osgir the Reconstructor. Quick shout out to Wanderer Bard who requested a video on Osgir. This is from the Strixhaven Precon. Did a little modifications to it. But the Precon is definitely the heart of this deck. Osgir is a 4-mana 4/4 with Vigilance. He is a giant artificer with 2 artifact central abilities. The first one, pay 1 and sacrifice an artifact to give target creature you control +2/+0 until end of turn. And the bottom ability, pay X and tap it. Exile an artifact card with mana value X from your graveyard. Create 2 tokens that are copies of the exiled card. Activate only as a sorcery. That is probably the main focus of the deck, is sacrificing artifacts to recur them by creating more token copies. So as you can imagine, we got a lot of artifacts. Let's hop right in here. Starting off with Lotus Bloom, which is the closest you're going to get to playing a Black Lotus probably. It's a Black Lotus with Suspend 3, so if you cast it from your hand, you pay 0, but you have to wait 3 turns to cast it. However, since it doesn't have a mana value, you can just tap Osgir without paying anything to return either of these from your graveyard to the battlefield. Mana Crypt, Lotus Petal, and Mox Tantalite will also work the same way. Soul Talisman is basically a soul ring with Suspend, and of course the OG soul ring. The mana rocks are a pretty big part of the game plan. You want to, if you can get a mana rock on turn 1 or 2, you get him out on turn 3, which helps accelerate things. We got Thought Vessel to give you no maximum hand size. Liquimetal Torque can turn things into artifacts, and it also taps for mana. Arcane Signet, Mind Stone, which you can sack to draw a card to create token copies to sack and draw some more cards. Boros Signet and Felwar Stone. We have a couple 3-mana rocks here. Curse Mirror, when it comes into the battlefield, you may have it become a copy of any creature on the battlefield except it has haste. So you can drop that in as a Wormcoil Engine or some other big thing. Commander Sphere, it is 3 mana, but you can sack it for free to draw a card and then create 2 copies to draw some more. Being a Boros deck, the card draw is pretty limited, so that will come in handy. For our non-rocks, we've got Mishra's Bauble, which you can peek at the top card of target player's library. It's also a 0 mana thing, so you can make free copies essentially, and it will draw you cards on the next upkeep. Soul Guide Lantern to exile cards from an opponent's graveyard and or draw cards with it. Dispeller's Capsule to remove artifacts and enchantments. Implement of Combustion can deal 1 damage to target player, and whenever it's put into the graveyard from the battlefield, you draw a card. You don't need to necessarily ping a player to do that. If you use Osgir to sack it, it will still draw you a card. Wayfarer's Bauble to get a basic land into play. And Chromatic Star will filter your mana while drawing you cards also. Mycosynth Wellspring and Ichor Wellspring. They both have ETB and put into the graveyard triggers. This one will let you search a basic land, put it into your hand. Ichor Wellspring will draw you a card when it enters and leaves. Swiftfoot Boots to give you hexproof and haste. If you got Lightning Greaves, those are probably better. Moonsilver Key lets you search for an artifact card with a mana ability. We've got a bunch of those, or a basic land card. 1000 Year Elixir will allow you to activate Osgir as though he had haste, and also you can pay 1 and tap it to untap him and activate it again. Sculpting Steel enters the battlefield as a copy of any creature on the battlefield. Not bad for 3 mana if you have a valid target. Treasure Chest is a fun little card. Roll a d20. Either you lose 3 life if you hit a 1, which sucks for you, but otherwise you'll get 5 treasure tokens, or gain 3 life, draw 3 cards. Those are the most likely options. Or if you hit a 20, search your library for a card. If it's an artifact card, put it onto the battlefield. Otherwise, put it into your hand. Mirage Mirror can also become a copy of target artifact, creature, enchantment, or land until end of turn. And now we will move into the creatures. Esper Sentinel for your premier 1-drop white card draw. Bomat Courier has haste. When it attacks, exile top card of your library face down. And then you can pay a red, discard your hand, probably when it's empty, to put all the exiled cards into their owner's hands. Goblin Welder, to sack an artifact and return an artifact from the graveyard to the battlefield. Mere Retriever, when it dies, return another target artifact from your graveyard to your hand. I'll put the Goblin Engineer here next to the Welder. It's pretty much the same ability, slightly different. When it enters, you can search for an artifact card and put it into your graveyard, which is good because we'll be reanimating stuff. And then you can do the same thing, except you have to pay a red, and the artifact from your graveyard has to be mana value 3 or less. Oswald Fiddlebender, you can sacrifice artifacts to get an artifact with that CMC +1. Milliken and Plague Mirror will add colorless mana to your mana pool, and Plague Mirror has Infect, which could possibly become relevant if you're using Osgir to pump it big enough, or to pump it up with something like Steel Overseer, which will put a +1/+1 counter on each artifact creature you control. Digsite Engineer will create colorless creatures, or rather artifact creatures. When you cast an artifact spell, you may pay 2. If you do, you're making basically the Urza token, a 0/0 construct with +1/+1 for each artifact you control. Brea's Apprentice, when it ETBs, creates a colorless Thopter, and you can tap it to sack an artifact and choose one. Exile top card of your library. Until the end of your next turn, you may play it or give target creature +2/+0. Phyrexian Dragon Engine is a artifact creature with double strike, and when it enters the battlefield from your graveyard, you may discard your hand. If you do, draw 3 cards. That doesn't work with Osgir because you're creating token copies. It leaves your battlefield, but it doesn't technically enter from the battlefield. That only works if you're unearthing it, but I figured with the double strike, it's still a pretty solid include. Lorehold will draw you cards whenever an artifact creature enters the battlefield, and it will also prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to attacking artifact creatures you control. Feldon of the Third Path. Pay 3 mana, tap it, create a token that's a copy of target creature card in your graveyard, except it's an artifact in addition to its other types. It gains haste, and sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. That's nice because you don't have to remove the cards from your graveyard, so you can just continuously make token copies as long as you have targets in the bin. Audacious Reshapers, you can sack an artifact, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal an artifact card, put that card onto the battlefield and the rest on the bottom of your library. It deals damage to you equal to the number of cards revealed this way, so luckily the deck is pretty densely packed with artifacts, so hopefully you won't take more than 5 damage, but if you're sacrificing something with a draw trigger or whatever, you can hopefully hit something big. Ingenious Artillerist, has whenever one or more artifacts ETB under your control, it deals that much damage to each opponent. So if you're making 2 token copies of something with Osgir, you'll deal 2 damage to each opponent. Scrap Trawler. When it or another artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, return to your hand target artifact in your graveyard with lesser mana value. Just more recursion. Speaking of which, we have Sanctum Gargoyle. When it ETBs, you may return target artifact from your graveyard to your hand. And Treasure Keeper. When it dies, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a non-land card with CMC 3 or less. You may cast it without paying its mana cost. Put the rest on the bottom. Another artifact creature that wants to die, Sad Robot, Solemn Simulacrum. Will search you for a basic and draw a card when it dies. Alibu Ancient Witness will give artifact creatures you control haste, and whenever one or more artifact creatures you control attack, it deals X damage to any target and you scry X, where X is the number of tapped artifacts you control. So that doesn't have to be artifact creatures, that'll be your artifact lands, your mana rocks, so you can usually do a decent amount of damage and do a solid scry with Alibu. Bronze Guardian gives your artifacts Ward 2, and it has double strike with power equal to the number of artifacts you control. It's a pretty big boy. Jorkadeen will pump the team. If you have 3 or more artifacts, it will give your creatures +3/+0, which is pretty solid beef. Ruin Grinder. When it dies, each player may discard their hand and draw 7 cards, so it is an optional Wheel of Fortune whenever it dies. Usually by the time you have 6 mana, your hand's going to be running relatively low, so that's a good option, and it's, worst case scenario, a menacing 7/4 beater. We also have Steel Hellkite to come in for some flying damage. You can pump it if you pay 2, and you can also destroy things with CMC X, where X is the amount of mana you pay after you deal damage with it. Wormcoil Engine. I feel like it needs no introduction, but in case you do, 6 mana 6/6 that basically splits in 2. It has Death Touch and Lifelink, and you create a 3/3 with Death Touch and a 3/3 with Lifelink when it dies. Steel Seraph is one of the prototype cards from Brothers War, so you can cast it for either 6 mana or 3. If you cast it for 3 mana, it's a 3/3. If you cast it for 6, it's a 5/4, and on the beginning of combat on your turn, target creature you control gains your choice of Flying, Vigilance, or Lifelink. Some pretty solid abilities. Hellkite Tyrant, possible win con. When it deals combat damage to a player, gain control of all artifacts that player controls. And at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 20 or more artifacts, you win the game. We're not super treasure heavy in this deck, but it is possible to get there with 20, especially if you're stealing artifacts from your opponents. Sun Titan will return a CMC card 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield when it ETBs and attacks. Duplicant will exile target non-token creature when it hits the battlefield, and then it becomes a copy. Well, not a true copy, but it has the power, toughness, and creature types of the card, so it doesn't gain any abilities, but it will effectively remove your opponent's stuff. And Mirror Battlesphere, when it enters the battlefield, create 4 colorless 1/1 mirror tokens, and when it attacks, you may tap X, untap Mirror to buff it +X/+0, where X is the number of mirror you tap, and it deals X damage to the player that it's attacking. Triplicate Titan is basically the new wave Wormcoil Engine. Instead of 2 3/3s, you get 3 3/3s. It's a 9 mana 9/9, and this time it's Flying, Vigilance, and Trample are the abilities on there that will get split up among the golems. Duretti Scrap Savant. a classic commander for the mono red artifact sacrifice stuff. He can let you discard cards to draw that many cards, discard up to 2 and draw that many. So you can start filling your bin with solid regeneration targets, and you can -2 to sack an artifact and return target artifact from your graveyard to the battlefield. And if you get to -10, you get an emblem with whenever an artifact is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, return it to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step. Gamble to search for any card and then discard a card at random. We don't mind discarding because our graveyard is a very important part of our game plan. Enlightened Tutor to search for an artifact or an enchantment if you are feeling a little different. Usually you'll find an artifact. Dispatch to exile a creature if you control 3 or more artifacts, otherwise it will tap the creature. Path to Exile, and Swords to Plowshares for the classic creature removal. So that is basically it for the deck. We got the land base, which we can take a look at now. Pardon my knocking stuff around here. Command Tower, Sacred Foundry, Clifftop Retreat, Sundown Pass, Needle Verge Pathway. This you choose red or white when it enters. Restless Biovac, Battlefield Forge. This can turn into a 2/2 Ox if you pay 3 mana, and when it attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Spectator Seeding. So those are our multicolored lands. We've got Secluded Steppe and Forgotten Cave to cycle if we don't need any more lands. Boros Garrison and Guildless Commons will bounce a land back to your hand, but they tap for 2 mana. And then we've got our artifact lands, which are pretty clutch. Don't forget that these can be targets for Osgir, so you can create 2 token copies of these lands from your graveyard, or you can sack them to pump things. We've got Myriad Landscape to search for some basics. Buried Ruin, pay 2 and sack it, return target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. That's pretty solid tech on a land. Rogue's Passage to give some stuff unblockable. Sequestered Stash, another artifact graveyard thing. Put the top 5 of your library into your graveyard, then you may put an artifact card from your graveyard on top of your library. Doesn't go to your hand, so not quite as good, but it does mill you some cards if your graveyard is low. And last but not least, we have Phyrexia's Core, which you can pay 1 and sack an artifact to gain 1 life. If you need a sacrifice outlet for your artifacts, in case Osgir is not on board. And in addition to that, we got the basic lands here. So that is pretty much it for Osgir. Fun deck. You can really kind of lean into the token theme. I really went hard on the reanimation tactics. If you wanted to go like a token treasure route, you could always do that. But pretty fun deck. I think it's slightly more optimized than the pre-con. Let me know what you guys think. Wanderer Bard, if you caught the video, appreciate you for the comment. If anybody has any more ideas for another deck tech they want to see, please feel free to leave a comment. And I appreciate everybody who has watched the entire video. Thank you for all my subscribers. People hitting the like button and commenting, I really appreciate it. And happy 2024. We'll see you in the next video.